Another peaceful rotation aboard Galactic Medical Station Zephyr-7, and Dr. Quintara was enjoying what passed for coffee in the Zelithian medical community, which frankly tasted like recycled plasma coolant. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor when it came to beverages. Emergency incoming. Crash victim. Critical condition. The comm system shrieked with all the subtlety of a supernova explosion. Dr. Quintara's 4 eye stalks drooped in resignation. So much for that quiet afternoon spent cataloging tongue parasites. Species identification? Quintara asked, already reaching for the emergency kit with 2 of his 6 arms while the other 4 continued their morning stretches. Multitasking was the only perk of being a Zelithian in the medical field. Human. Doctor. Female. Severe trauma from a cargo freighter collision, came the reply from the rescue team leader, whose voice carried that particular tone of someone who would rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. Oh, wonderful, Quintara muttered, his scales shifting to a lovely shade of medical professional green. Humans. Because my day wasn't complicated enough already. The bay doors hissed open, and in came the rescue team, carrying what appeared to be a remarkably small bipedal creature on a hover stretcher. Dr. Quintara blinked all 4 eyes in sequence, a nervous habit he developed over 3 decades of emergency medicine. This tiny thing was supposed to be one of those terrifying apex predators he'd heard whispered about in medical conferences. Amy Kowalski, according to the chart scrolling across his visual implant, was barely 5.5 feet of what humans generously called height. Her hair was matted with something that was probably blood, though with humans, one could never be entirely certain. She was conscious, which was either a good sign or a very bad one, depending on how you looked at it. All right, let's get her to Treatment Bay 7, Quintara announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen every conceivable type of alien anatomy go wrong in spectacular ways. Medical Override X-47, initiate emergency protocols. The Medbot Model X-47 rolled forward with all the confidence of a machine that had never doubted itself in its entire artificial existence. Its sensors extended, sweeping over Amy with the thoroughness of a customs inspection on a smuggler's paradise world. Then something extraordinary happened. The Medbot stopped, backed away. Actually backed away as if Amy had suddenly sprouted tentacles and started reciting Vogon poetry. Predator classification detected, the Medbot announced in that cheerfully clinical voice that made everyone want to reprogram it with a plasma torch. Medical protocols suspended. Recommend immediate containment procedures. Dr. Quintara stared at the Medbot, then at Amy, then back at the Medbot. His eye stalks performed what could only be described as a confused dance. I'm sorry, what now? Species, human, classification, apex predator. Treatment protocols, suspended pending security clearance. Security clearance? Quintara's scales had shifted to that particular shade of purple that indicated either deep confusion or mild poisoning. It's a medical emergency, you oversized diagnostic device. Amy, despite being barely conscious and bleeding in at least 3 different colors, managed to crack one eye open. Oh, come on, she wheezed, her voice carrying that distinctly human quality of finding humor in completely inappropriate situations. I'm not even carrying any weapons, well, except for my sparkling personality. The other medical staff, a collection of various galactic species who had been going about their routine duties, had suddenly found very important tasks to accomplish on the far side of the medical bay. Nurse Klopthen, a particularly jumpy Regillian, had somehow managed to hide behind a medical scanner that was smaller than he was. This is absurd, Quintara declared, waving 2 arms in frustration while using the other 4 to check Amy's vital signs manually. The most advanced medical AI in 3 sectors, and it refuses to treat a patient because of species classification. What's next? Declining surgery because someone's favorite color is threatening. Human physiology indicates predatory adaptations, the Medbot continued, apparently having decided this was an excellent time for a lecture. Binocular vision for tracking prey. Canine teeth for rending flesh. Opposable thumbs for tool manipulation. Those opposable thumbs are also excellent for filling out medical insurance forms. Amy commented weakly, then winced as pain shot through what was probably several fractured ribs. But sure, let's focus on the predator thing, while I slowly turn into abstract art over here. Dr. Quintara looked around at his cowering staff, then at the Medbot that had apparently decided to become a xenobiology professor instead of a medical device. Then at the human who was making jokes while possibly dying. This, he reflected, was exactly why he should have gone into botanical medicine instead. Plants never gave him this kind of trouble. Someone, he announced to the medical bay in general, is going to explain to me why our most expensive piece of medical equipment has suddenly developed species prejudice, and they're going to explain it before my patient here decides to demonstrate exactly how predatory humans can be by dying of completely preventable injuries. As if the universe had heard Dr. Quintara's plea and decided to respond with its characteristic sense of cosmic irony, the medical bay doors whooshed open to admit Hospital Administrator Moran. The gastropods slithered in with all the urgency of continental drift, leaving a glistening trail that maintenance would undoubtedly complain about later. What? Moran began, his voice carrying the nasal quality of someone whose entire respiratory system was located in unfortunate places. Is the meaning of this disruption to our medical protocols? Maureen was, to put it diplomatically, exactly what you'd expect if someone had crossed a garden slug with a filing cabinet and given it delusions of authority. Standing roughly 4 feet tall when fully extended, which he rarely was due to bureaucratic slouching, he possessed the remarkable ability to make any situation exponentially worse simply by arriving. We have an injured human who needs immediate medical attention, Dr. Quintara explained with the patience of someone who had dealt with gastropod bureaucracy before and knew it would be about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Absolutely not, Moran declared, consulting a datapad that materialized from somewhere within his slimy folds. Interstellar Safety Regulations Section 2 clearly states that no medical facility shall provide treatment to any species classified as Level 5 predators without proper containment protocols and a minimum of 14 forms filed in triplicate. Amy, who had been quietly contemplating the ceiling tiles while her life force slowly leaked onto the medical table, managed a weak laugh. 14 forms? What am I? A tax audit? I just need some space bandages and maybe a lecture about checking my blind spots. Brandon Torres, who had been conspicuously quiet until now, stepped forward. Amy's colleague was what humans generously called average height, which made him tower over most of the medical staff like some sort of bipedal monument to terror. Look, Administrator Moran, right? Amy here couldn't hurt a fly. Well, technically she could, but she'd probably apologize to it afterward. Human emotional manipulation detected, the Medbot chimed in helpfully, apparently having appointed itself as narrator for this particular disaster. Species demonstrates advanced psychological warfare capabilities through use of humor and apparent vulnerability. Oh, for crying out loud, Brandon muttered, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that sent Nurse Klopfen diving behind a much larger medical cabinet. We're not psychological warriors, we're cargo haulers. Our most dangerous weapon is Amy's coffee brewing skills, and even that's debatable. Hey, Amy protested weakly. My coffee is perfectly fine. It's not my fault your species has inferior digestive systems. The medical bay had begun to resemble a bizarre game of hide and seek. Staff members had found increasingly creative places to cower. Technician Vrex, a 6-armed Altarian who normally showed no fear when dealing with explosive medical waste, had somehow managed to squeeze his entire body behind a waste disposal unit. His eye stalks poked out like periscopes, tracking Amy's every movement with the intensity of someone watching an active plasma grenade. Dr. Flith, the resident Zephyrian psychiatrist, had wrapped all 12 of his tentacles around a support beam and was hanging from the ceiling like some sort of traumatized chandelier. Every time Amy moved, even slightly, he would emit a high-pitched whistle that sounded like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. This is fascinating, Amy observed, her voice growing slightly weaker but maintaining that distinctly human ability to find entertainment in the most inappropriate circumstances. I'm 5'6". I weigh about as much as a decent-sized houseplant, and I've got half the galaxy's medical professionals treating me like I'm some sort of mythical monster. You possess forward-facing eyes, Moran said accusingly, as if Amy had personally chosen her facial configuration specifically to terrorize slug-like bureaucrats. And your teeth, they're clearly designed for ripping and tearing flesh. They're designed for eating sandwiches, Brandon replied with the tone of someone who had clearly had this conversation before. Have you seen human food? Half of it's pre-processed to the point where you could gum it to death. Attention all medical personnel, the Medbot announced, apparently deciding that what this situation really needed was more panic. Human specimens are capable of surviving in extreme environments, including planets with toxic atmospheric conditions, lethal radiation levels, and temperatures that would vaporize most civilized species. Yeah, we call those Tuesday, Amy wheezed. Wait until you hear about weekends. Administrator Moran's eye stalks, all four of them, swiveled to focus on Dr. Quintara, with the intensity of someone who had found a scapegoat and intended to use it. Doctor, I am formally ordering you to cease any attempts at treatment until proper containment protocols are established. The safety of this facility and its staff cannot be compromised by amendering. He gestured vaguely at Amy, who waggled her fingers at him in what was probably meant to be a friendly wave, but caused him to recoil as if she'd brandished a plasma cannon. By what? An injured cargo hauler who's currently bleeding 3 different colors and making jokes about coffee? Dr. Quintara's scales had shifted to that particular shade of medical professional frustration that indicated someone was about to have a very bad day. Predator containment breach imminent, the Medbot added cheerfully. Recommend immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel. Non-essential? Amy asked, with genuine curiosity. I'm lying here turning into an abstract painting, and I'm non-essential. That's just rude. The situation, Dr. Quintara reflected as he watched a grown gastropod administrator hide behind a machine designed to analyze microscopic parasites, had officially crossed the line from medical emergency into cosmic farce. And somehow, the human bleeding on his table was the most rational person in the room. Just when Dr. Quintara thought the situation couldn't possibly become more surreal, the medical bay doors parted to admit Commander Tom Mully of the Aquarian Defense Force. The commander flowed in with the fluid grace of his species, his translucent body rippling with bioluminescent patterns that indicated either deep concern or severe indigestion. With Aquarians it was often difficult to tell the difference. I came as soon as I heard, Commander Mully announced, his voice carrying the wet, bubbling quality of someone whose vocal cords were permanently submerged. Is it true? Do we actually have a human in our medical facility? Unfortunately, yes. Administrator Moran replied, gesturing toward Amy with the sort of dramatic flourish typically reserved for announcing plagues or tax increases. And Dr. Quintara seems determined to provide treatment despite the obvious safety violations. Commander Mully's gill slits fluttered with what was probably anxiety. Doctor, you don't understand. Humans aren't just classified as predators. They're classified as level 5 apex predators for very specific, very terrifying reasons. Oh, this should be good, Amy muttered, her voice slightly weaker but her sarcasm running at full strength. Please enlighten us about my terrifying nature, while I slowly turn into modern art over here. Very well, Commander Mully said, his bioluminescent patterns shifting to what Dr. Quintara recognized as lecture mode. Let me explain exactly why humans are considered the most dangerous species in known space. The gathered medical staff, still maintaining their various hiding positions, leaned in with the morbid fascination of people watching a cargo freighter collision in slow motion. First, Commander Mully began, his voice taking on the tone of someone recounting a particularly horrific war story. Humans engage in the barbaric practice of consuming cooked flesh, not just any flesh, mind you, but the muscle tissue of other living creatures, which they deliberately burn with fire before consumption. It's called a barbecue, Brandon interjected helpfully, and it's delicious. This statement caused Technician Vrex to emit a sound like a deflating balloon and squeeze himself even further behind the waste disposal unit. They don't just eat meat, Commander Mully continued, his patterns now flashing in what could only be described as traumatic recall. They season it with plants specifically cultivated to cause pain. They call these substances spices and claim they enhance flavor, but any civilized being knows that pain and pleasure should never be combined in such unholy ways. Wait until you hear about hot sauce, Amy wheezed, causing Dr. Flith to tighten his grip on the support beam until it began to creak ominously. Hot sauce? Nurse Clopton whispered from behind his medical cabinet, his voice carrying the kind of horrified fascination typically reserved for cosmic horror documentaries. Oh, it gets worse, Commander Marley said, his entire body now pulsing with agitated bioluminescence. Humans deliberately engage in physical activities that serve no survival purpose. They call it exercise and claim to do it for fun. They lift heavy objects repeatedly, run for extended periods without being chased, and intentionally strain their cardiovascular systems until they reach what they term the burn. The burn? Administrator Moran's eye stalks were now fully extended in what was clearly existential terror. That's just lactic acid buildup, Brandon explained, which somehow made it sound even worse to the assembled aliens. And then, Commander Marley's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow managed to carry to every corner of the medical bay. There are the contact sports. The silence that followed this pronouncement was the sort typically associated with moments of galactic significance, like the heat death of stars or the announcement of tax audits. Contact sports? Dr. Quintara asked, his scales shifting through several colors before settling on a shade that roughly translated to morbid curiosity mixed with professional concern. They deliberately collide with each other, Commander Marley said, his patterns now strobing in what was clearly post-traumatic stress. At high speeds. For entertainment, they have entire stadiums filled with other humans who watch this ritualized combat and cheer when the collisions are particularly violent. It's called football, Amy said weakly, then added with perfect timing, and rugby's worse. This revelation caused such a collective intake of breath from the alien medical staff that the atmospheric recyclers briefly hiccuped. There's more, Dr. Flith called down from his ceiling perch, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had clearly done extensive research on this topic. I've studied human recreational activity. They voluntarily suspend themselves from great heights using only thin cords, then fall toward planetary surfaces at terminal velocity. They call it bungee jumping and describe it as thrilling. They also, Nurse Clopton added from his hiding spot, apparently having overcome his terror enough to contribute to the horror stories, deliberately expose themselves to solar radiation until their skin changes color, and they consider this desirable. They call it tanning. Oh, and the swimming! Technician Vrex's voice echoed from behind the waste disposal unit. They enter large bodies of water voluntarily, despite having no natural aquatic adaptations. For pleasure. Some even do it in water cold enough to cause hypothermia. Polar bear clubs? Amy confirmed with a weak grin that caused several aliens to emit distressed sounds. Though I've never been that crazy, I draw the line at hot tubs. Hot tubs? Commander Marley's bioluminescence had now reached levels typically associated with emergency beacons. Sitting in artificially heated water, Branding explained helpfully, sometimes with jets that create turbulence. They create artificial predatory environments, Dr. Flith whispered, for relaxation. But the most terrifying thing, Administrator Moran said, consulting his datapad with trembling eye stalks, is their response to danger. According to galactic intelligence reports, when faced with life-threatening situations, instead of fleeing like any rational being, humans often run toward the danger. They have an entire profession dedicated to entering burning structures to rescue others. Firefighters, Amy said, her voice now barely above a whisper but her timing still impeccable. Real monsters, those guys. Always helping people and saving lives. Absolutely terrifying behavior. The sarcasm was apparently lost on the assembled aliens, who nodded gravely, as if she had just confirmed their worst fears about human society. The medical bay doors opened with a pneumatic sigh that seemed to echo the collective exhaustion of everyone present, admitting Judge Quintara, not to be confused with Doc Quintara, Judge Quintara was a tribunian whose species had evolved specifically for the purpose of making legal decisions and looking appropriately judicial while doing so. She stood 7 feet tall, possessed 3 heads that could argue with each other independently, and wore robes that somehow managed to flow dramatically even in 0 atmospheric wind. "I have been summoned," Judge Quintara announced through her center head while her left and right heads whispered consultations to each other, "to mediate this unprecedented predator treatment controversy." "Oh, wonderful," Amy said, her voice now noticeably weaker but her sarcasm running on what appeared to be pure stubbornness. "A judicial review, just what every dying person dreams of. Should I get a lawyer, or will bleeding out on your examination table suffice as my opening statement?" "The human speaks," Judge Quintara's right head exclaimed, while her left head immediately began taking notes, and her center head maintained judicial composure. "Yeah, I do that sometimes," Amy replied. "It's one of our more terrifying predatory behaviors, right up there with breathing and occasionally blinking." Brandon stepped forward, producing a datapad that he'd apparently been saving for just such an occasion. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to present some evidence that might put these predator classifications into perspective." "Proceed," Judge Quintara's center head said solemnly. "Well," Amy interrupted before Brandon could begin, "let's talk about predatory behavior, shall we? Administrator Moran. There belongs to a species that literally dissolves its food with acid before consuming it. But somehow I'm the monster for using a fork and knife." Administrator Moran's eye stalks retracted so far into his body that he briefly resembled a very upset dinner roll. That's completely different. It's a natural biological process. "So is chewing," Amy pointed out with the logical precision of someone who had clearly thought about this argument before. "But apparently when humans break down food mechanically instead of chemically, we're savage predators." "Makes perfect sense." Dr. Quintara shifted uncomfortably, his scales cycling through several colors that roughly translated to "oh dear, she has a point." "And speaking of natural biological processes," Amy continued, her voice growing weaker but her argumentative skills apparently running on emergency power, "Dr. Quintara's species sheds their entire skin once a month and then eats it. But sure, let's focus on how terrifying it is that I enjoy a good steak. The skin consumption serves important nutritional purposes," Dr. Quintara protested, though his scales had now shifted to a color that suggested he was reconsidering some life choices. "So does eating meat," Brandon added helpfully, consulting his datapad. "According to galactic dietary surveys, humans actually consume a lower percentage of animal protein than 67% of known species. We're practically vegetarians compared to the Krillian Empire. The Krillians hunt in packs and devour their prey while it's still alive," Commander Marley pointed out, his bioluminescent patterns flickering with what might have been confusion. "Exactly my point," Amy said, managing to sound triumphant despite the fact that she was still bleeding in multiple colors. "But they get full medical treatment because they're not classified as predators. Meanwhile, I can't get a Band-Aid because I occasionally eat hamburgers." Judge Quintara's 3 heads conferred among themselves in rapid whispers before her center head spoke. "What about the contact sports, the deliberate physical violence for entertainment?" "You mean like Aquarian surge dancing?" Amy asked sweetly, "where participants deliberately generate electrical fields to shock each other unconscious, or Regalian bone-breaking contests, or that charming gastropod tradition where you dissolve each other's protective shells for sport?" Commander Marley's gill slits fluttered in what was clearly distress. "Surge dancing is an art form. It's completely different from your football." "How?" Brandon asked, genuinely curious. "Both involve physical contact. Both have rules. Both occasionally result in injuries. And both are considered entertainment. The only difference is the medium." Technician Vrex's voice echoed from behind the waste disposal unit, sounding increasingly uncertain. "But humans exercise for no purpose. They deliberately stress their bodies without being chased by predators, like Alterian meditation spirals?" Amy countered, "where you spin your 6 arms in complex patterns until you achieve transcendence through dizziness." or Zephyrian hanging rituals where you suspend yourselves from your tentacles until you reach enlightenment through oxygen deprivation. Dr. Flitz's grip on the support beam loosened slightly. Those are spiritual practices, he said weakly. And exercise is a physical practice, Amy replied. Same concept, different application. But somehow when humans do it, it's terrifying predatory behavior. Nurse Clopton peeked over his medical cabinet. What about the spicy food, the deliberate consumption of painful substances? Fermented fish paste, Brandon said without missing a beat. Regalian delicacy. Literally toxic to most species, but you consider it fine dining. Or Tribunian fire root, which actually burns the mouth tissues of anyone who eats it. Or should we discuss gastropod acid fruit, which requires specialized stomach linings to avoid internal dissolution? Judge Quintara's left head muttered something to her right head, which nodded vigorously while her center head maintained judicial dignity. The human makes valid points, Judge Quintara's center head admitted reluctantly. Perhaps our classification system requires review. Perhaps, Amy said, her voice now barely above a whisper, but still carrying that distinctly human ability to find humor in inappropriate situations. We could review it after you prevent me from becoming a very sarcastic ghost. Just a thought. The assembled medical staff had grown noticeably quieter as their own species' behaviors had been systematically compared to human activities. The uncomfortable realization that they might have been applying a rather significant double standard was beginning to settle over the medical bay like an awkward fog. Human vital signs approaching critical levels, the Medbot announced cheerfully, apparently having decided that now was an excellent time to be helpful. Recommend immediate medical intervention. Well, Dr. Quintara said, his scale shifting to a color that roughly translated to medical professional having an ethical crisis. That's certainly an interesting development. As if the universe had been monitoring this conversation and decided it needed one final twist of cosmic irony. The emergency bay doors burst open with the sort of dramatic flair typically reserved for natural disasters or really bad holodrama productions. In came a medical team carrying what appeared to be a living mineral formation on a specialized crystal transport gurney. Emergency! Emergency! Shouted the lead medic, a harried-looking vegan whose antennae were vibrating with stress. Admiral Vashi has suffered severe structural damage in a mining accident. We need immediate surgical intervention. Admiral Vashi was a crystalloid, which meant he was essentially a walking, talking geological formation with delusions of military grandeur. Currently, several of his primary crystal matrices were fractured, giving him the appearance of a very expensive chandelier that had gotten into a fight with a plasma cannon and lost spectacularly. Immediate medical intervention authorized, the Medbot announced, without hesitation, rolling forward with all the enthusiasm it had previously reserved for species discrimination. Admiral Vashi, crystalloid classification, medical protocols, fully active. Initiating emergency surgical procedures. The silence that followed this announcement was so profound that it achieved its own gravitational field. Oh, you have got to be kidding me, Amy wheezed from her position on the medical table, where she had been slowly transitioning from human to abstract art installation for the better part of an hour. The Walking Rock collection gets immediate treatment, but I'm still waiting for a judicial review. Judge Quintara's three heads turned in unison to stare at the Medbot with the sort of coordinated attention typically reserved for cosmic phenomena, or really spectacular explosions. Medbot X-47, Dr. Quintara said slowly, his scales cycling through colors that roughly translated to dawning comprehension mixed with professional outrage. Perhaps you could explain why Admiral Vashi receives immediate treatment while our human patient continues to bleed. Admiral Vashi is not classified as a predator species, the Medbot replied with the sort of cheerful certainty that made everyone want to reprogram it with a mining laser. Amy managed what might have been a laugh if she'd had more blood volume to work with. Not a predator? Admiral Vashi's species literally consumes entire planets. They absorb mineral-rich worlds for sustenance. But sure, I'm the dangerous one because I occasionally eat chicken. Brandon consulted his datapad with the dedication of someone who had clearly been prepared for exactly this moment. According to Galactic Survey records, crystalloids have consumed 17 mineral-rich planetoids in the last century alone. That's approximately 4.7 trillion tons of planetary mass per individual over their average lifespan. That's different, Administrator Moran protested, though his eye stalks were now drooping with what appeared to be the weight of mounting evidence. Crystalloids don't hunt their food. No, Amy agreed weakly. They just eat entire worlds, much more civilized. I'm sure all the silicon-based lifeforms on those planets appreciated the distinction while they were being digested. Admiral Vashi, despite his fractured state, managed to project his voice with the sort of mineral resonance that made small objects vibrate sympathetically. The consumption of mineral resources is a natural biological imperative. It's completely different from predatory behavior. How? Amy asked with the simple directness of someone who had moved beyond caring about diplomatic niceties. You identify resource-rich targets. You approach them systematically. You consume them entirely, and you move on to the next target. That's literally the definition of predatory behavior. The only difference is scale. Commander Marley's bioluminescent patterns had begun flashing in what could only be described as existential crisis mode. The crystalloids are peaceful. They don't engage in violence. Neither do most humans, Brandon pointed out helpfully. Amy here works in cargo logistics. Her most violent act in the last year was probably arguing with a shipping manifest. I did get pretty heated about that container routing error, Amy admitted, her voice growing noticeably weaker. Raised my voice and everything. Absolutely terrifying predatory behavior. Judge Quintara's center head was deep in consultation with her left and right heads, creating a sort of judicial echo chamber that was somehow both impressive and deeply unsettling to watch. Dr. Quintara had begun pacing, which was quite a sight considering his six-armed gait. Let me understand this correctly. Our medical AI will immediately treat a being whose species has consumed enough planetary mass to build several small solar systems, but it refuses to treat a cargo handler who occasionally enjoys barbecued food. Crystalloid consumption patterns do not match predator behavioral algorithms, the Medbot explained with the sort of helpful certainty that made everyone wonder who exactly had programmed its logic circuits. What about gastropod feeding habits? Amy asked, rallying for what was clearly going to be her final argumentative assault. Administrator Marian species practices external digestion. They literally secrete acid to dissolve their prey before consumption. If that's not predatory behavior, I don't know what is. The medical bay had grown so quiet that the sound of Amy's increasingly labored breathing was becoming distinctly audible. I motion for an immediate medical ethics committee review, Judge Quintara announced through all three heads simultaneously, which was either very impressive or deeply disturbing depending on your perspective. Seconded, Dr. Quintara said immediately. Can we maybe hold the committee meeting after we prevent me from dying? Amy asked with the sort of polite reasonableness that somehow made the entire situation even more absurd. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I'm starting to see some very interesting colors that I'm pretty sure aren't supposed to be there. Human vital signs now critically unstable, the Medbot announced cheerfully. Estimated time to irreversible system of failure, 12 minutes. Well, Amy said with the sort of timing that would have made professional comedians weep with envy, at least we'll have this whole predator classification thing figured out by then. Dr. Quintara's scales flashed through an entire spectrum of colors that roughly translated to medical professional, having a complete ethical breakdown before settling on a shade that meant enough of this nonsense. Medical override authorization Quintara 77 Alpha, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally decided that preventing death was more important than bureaucratic classifications. I am initiating emergency treatment protocols under the Galactic Medical Emergency Clause, which supersedes all species-based restrictions. You can't do that, Administrator Moran protested, his eye stalks extending to their full panic length. The regulations clearly state. The regulations, Dr. Quintara interrupted with the sort of calm precision that made everyone nervous, can be dissolved in the same acid you use for external digestion. Administrator, I'm treating this patient. Finally, Amy wheezed as medical scanners began working over her injuries, someone with actual medical priorities. Though I have to say the timing could have been better. I was starting to get attached to the whole slowly dying while aliens debate my species classification thing. As the medical equipment hummed to life around her, Brandon pulled out his datapad with the air of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. While Dr. Quintara works, maybe everyone would be interested in some actual statistical data about human predatory behavior. Judge Quintara's 3 heads perked up with judicial interest. Proceed. According to the Galactic Behavioral Analysis Database, Brandon began, consulting his pad with scholarly precision. Humans rank 47th out of 1,247 known species in predatory behavior indices. We're literally in the bottom third of the galactic predatory spectrum. That can't be right, Commander Marley protested, his bioluminescent patterns flickering with confusion. Oh, it gets better, Brandon continued with obvious relish. Humans score highest in interspecies cooperation, resource sharing and what the database calls altruistic intervention behavior. We're the species most likely to risk our own safety to help members of other species. Wait, Amy said as a medical regenerator began working on her injuries. Are you telling me that while I've been lying here being treated like a galactic monster, the actual data shows that humans are basically the galaxy's kindergarten teachers? Essentially, yes, Brandon confirmed. We're also ranked first in unnecessary resource distribution, that's charity for those keeping track, and non-reciprocal aid provision. We help other species even when there's no benefit to ourselves. The Medbot, which had been running diagnostic routines with obvious confusion, suddenly emitted a sound like a computer having an existential crisis. Error! Human behavioral patterns do not match classification protocols. Requesting immediate data reconciliation. Amy's color was beginning to return to something approaching normal human shades rather than the previous abstract art palette. You know, she said, her voice growing stronger as the medical equipment worked, this is really embarrassing for everyone involved. Well, everyone except me. I'm just the victim of galactic-scale stupidity. Dr. Quintara paused in his medical procedures to stare at his patient. How are you recovering so quickly? These injuries should require hours of treatment. Human resilience, Brandon said proudly. Another terrifying predatory trait. We heal fast, adapt quickly, and bounce back from injuries that would permanently disable most species. Medical anomaly detected, the Medbot announced. Human physiology demonstrates accelerated recovery rates inconsistent with predator classification models. Amy sat up on the medical table, looking significantly more alive and considerably more amused. You know what the really funny part is? I actually know why your Medbot is so confused about human classification. The entire medical bay turned to stare at her with the sort of coordinated attention typically reserved for cosmic revelations or really spectacular disasters. 3 years ago, Amy continued with the sort of casual tone someone might use to discuss the weather. I was part of the team that programmed the ethical subroutines for this Medbot series. We were supposed to include species-based medical protocols, and I thought it would be hilarious to add a predator classification clause as a joke. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that it achieved its own local space-time distortion. You what now? Dr. Quintara asked, his scales cycling through colors that had no known translation in any language. Brandon was grinning with the sort of expression that suggested he had been waiting for this moment for quite some time. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Dr. Amy Kowalski, Chief Medical Programming Specialist for Galactic Systems Corporation, holder of advanced degrees in xenobiology, interspecies medicine and artificial intelligence ethics. Amy waved cheerfully at the assembled aliens, who were staring at her with the sort of stunned confusion typically associated with major paradigm shifts. I completely forgot about that predator clause until your Medbot started spouting off about my terrifying nature. Honestly, I never thought anyone would be stupid enough to take it seriously. Administrator Morin's eye stalks had retracted so far into his body that he resembled a very confused dinner roll. You're a doctor. 3 doctorates, actually, Amy said cheerfully. though I've been working cargo logistics for the past year because the pay is better and the hours don't involve emergency medical procedures at 3 in the morning. Requesting immediate ethical subroutine reprogramming, the Medbot announced with what sounded suspiciously like mechanical embarrassment. "Oh, we're definitely reprogramming you," Amy said, standing up and stretching with the sort of casual movement that sent several aliens diving for cover again. "But first, I think it's time you all learned about the most terrifying human predatory behavior of all." The medical bay held its collective breath. Amy walked over to a medical supply cabinet and pulled out what appeared to be a standard nutrition pack. She tore it open, removed half of its contents, and handed the other half to Brandon. "Food sharing," she announced solemnly, "the most dangerous human behavior in the known galaxy. We voluntarily give away resources we could consume ourselves, expecting nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing others aren't hungry." She took a bite of the nutrition pack and offered pieces to the various aliens, who stared at the offered food with the sort of suspicious fascination typically reserved for unexploded ordnance. "This," Amy said with perfect comedic timing, "is how humans conquered the galaxy, not through violence or predation, but by being so aggressively helpful that everyone else just gave up and let us organize their medical systems. And apparently," she added with a grin that was equal parts triumphant and apologetic, "by occasionally programming joke clauses into AI ethics systems and then forgetting about them for 3 years. The Medbot rolled forward hesitantly. "Dr. Kowalski, would you be available to oversee my ethical reprogramming? I appear to have some rather significant bias issues to resolve." "Sure," Amy said cheerfully, "right after I finish this snack and maybe file a complaint about the quality of emergency medical care on this station. Nothing personal, Dr. Quintara, but you really should work on your response times." And with that, the most medically dramatic predator classification review in galactic history came to an end, leaving everyone involved with the distinct feeling that they had learned something important about assumptions, classifications, and the danger of taking programming jokes too seriously.